Okay, thank you very, very much for coming tonight. It's great to be here. Feels like I've done this before, but this is slightly different, this talk, so bear with me. As I start off, I'd just like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Gawler people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Gawler people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Gawler people today. I'll also acknowledge Patricia Booth, who is, of course, it is my co-author. The book and this talk wouldn't have happened without her. She sometimes thinks she's the silent partner, but she's the strength in this team, let me tell you. The other people to acknowledge, of course, oh no, I'm doing this, that's right. There we go. Our publisher. And the fifth gentleman on the left is Michael Bowen, who's here tonight and is going to sell you not only our book, if you're interested, but there's also a lot of great South Australian history books, including Pendragon, which is the one about George Isaacs, who's a Gawler person as well. And to the right is our editor, a lady called Maddie Sexton, who can't be here tonight, because to get out of coming tonight, she broke her arm, so that's, you know, that's how it goes. But Maddie had the fortune to be our editor, and she very gently and very firmly took us through the process of taking, I think, 80,000 words down to a book. And anyone who's ever tried to do that, it's challenging. And several times she would say, Helen, it's really, really, really interesting, but I think it's a little too Gawler specific. And I find that hard to believe, that anything is not of interest to the whole wide world about Gawler, but we did cut some bits out, and the talk tonight is basically the bits that we cut out. It's so there's 20 items, 20 topics. They're very Gawler specific, I know that, I've been told. They were really new and fascinating information for us, and I think they need some further research and their stories more fully told. So I've presented them in the order in which they appear in the book, and as the slides come up, there'll be a page number there. So if you're interested in following through, that will be a bit of a guide where you'll find where that information is referred to, but not in a great lot of detail. I will supply my notes to the wonderful Ian, and when he puts this PowerPoint up, there'll be some more information, because Pat made me take all the information off the slides because it was absolutely too full. So yeah. Okay. Before I start on the 20 slides, though, I just wanted to share with you one of our major learnings. If you're doing research, please make sure you grab the reference of the place from which you got that information, for a number of reasons. It actually, I think, shows that your research is serious and that you've gone and used useful resources. But it also allows people who are interested in the topic to follow where you've been and continue the research. But don't do like us. Don't decide at some point that it's all too much and you'll just strip them out to make it easier to read, because going back later and adding resources will drive you mad. I can guarantee that. If you're not sure how to grab, references nowadays are often provided by the sources that you're looking at. So if you're a Trove user, or you're using library catalogues, or you're using some academic sites, they actually give you the reference. So you can copy and cut from this site. If you're not sure how to do that, I happen to know that Jacinta is going to run a workshop shortly at the Heritage Centre. So if you just want half an hour, somebody to show you how to do it, I'm sure, just let Jacinta know, and I'm sure she'd be only too happy to organise that. And it's a useful thing to have, but until somebody shows you, of course you won't know how to do it. So yeah, that was just a learning that we had. Okay, let's get started. First thing we found is in an article written by Mrs. William Dawkins of her reminiscence of Gawler, she mentions the first brick house built on Church Hill. And so that really piqued my interest. So we went looking. The place doesn't exist anymore. It is, let me see if I can get this in. It's up here, just behind where the Zion preschool is at the moment. That's where it would have been. It was built by this chap on the left, Samuel Pope, who was married to Harry, E.H. Coombe's maternal aunt, Anne Coombe. So he built it in about 1846. He lived in it very briefly, but he soon vacated it to allow Phoebe and Walter Duffield, some of you might know that name from Parapara, they rented the little 5-room cottage that Pope had built, while their brand new residence, the 8-roomed building house opposite, was being built. Now that building, if you know Finner Street at all, is owned by the Bell Chambers. That's the building there. And the reason that they were building their new house there is that Walter Duffield had just bought the Victoria Mill, which was only about a couple of years old, and he bought it from Stephen King. And that was the first flour mill in Gawler. So it all type of lines up, that, you know, it's all together. So once you understand, I just found that a bit interesting. But it does show, so Gawler's kicked off, as Brian Tom said, our birthday is the 31st of January 1839, but within, 6-7 years we had a brick house going up. There were other houses around Gawler. A lot of them were wattle and daub and whatever, but we had. I'd be interested to know, for example, where did he get the bricks from? Were they bricks locally made, or were they bricks coming in from somewhere else? So that type of thing interests me. The other thing, of course, the connection is Samuel Pope also built the Wheatsheaf Hotel. So it seems like he built a couple of, a few things around the town. And thank you to Margaret Koch, who, who helped me locate the Pope's farm, which was out near their property. Okay, second one. Oops, wrong one. Okay, in looking at when E.H. Coombe's father came to Gawler, which was about 1855, I started to get curious about what Gawler would have looked like. So now we're a little further into Gawler's growth. The colony at that stage had 85,000, according to the sources that I looked at. Of that, about 1,800 were Wesleyan, because the Coombes were Wesleyan in faith. But when I looked at the figures, it's saying in 1855 that Gawler actually has less than 1,000 people, which seems a little small, and of that, a very small proportion of those are Wesleyans. So it just got me interested because I quite like stats. And what we know is the first European settlers were here in Gawler in 1839. For the next few years, we were catering for the passing traffic that went up to the Kapunda mine and the Burra mine. So we were basically a stop along the way. When the traffic to those mines reduces, they start to use other ways of getting the ore down. Gawler has already become a regional centre with its own local industry and trade. I think that's where whilst this source is saying that Gawler itself had less than 1,000 people, we're very much a regional centre. So we've got lots more people in the surrounding areas, and we know that. Concordia, Sandy Creek, Gawler River, Smithfield, they're all strongly associated with Gawler. So I think if we looked at the population of the region, it would make a little bit more sense. And to back up my hypothesis, in 1858 we had 6 doctors operating in Gawler. So we've got less than 1,000 people, but we've got 6 doctors. So what does that say? They must be servicing a larger area. However, to balance against that, at this stage, people didn't have one career. You had multiple income streams. And we know several of those doctors also had farms. So, but I still think they're practicing their medicine on a group of people. And my guess is that they're the only doctors for quite a long way. It's highly possible that if you had an injury at Kapunda or Burra that was serious enough, they may well have transported you to Gawler to deal with this. Anyway, I think it bears a bit more investigation. Okay, the next one is very much Willaston based. Willaston is different to Gawler, I will admit that was my error. Okay, so as you probably know, the Coombes ran the Willaston General Store, which is now the bookshop, and the person on the right is a man called Job Harris, who's in the histories, he's acknowledged as the person who opened the first post office in the Willaston store. However, thanks to the help of people like Martin, it became obvious that it wasn't just Job. The person that's important is this James Davies. Now, he's listed as a lime burner of Bertha, and the large picture here is actually his kiln, which is in High Street, Willaston, and that's the area that was known as Bertha. James Davies sold land to the young Harry Coombe, and he married twice and he had children in both marriages, so it's a very large and complex family. And when you start unpicking all of it, Job Harris is his stepson, and he also had a son-in-law married to one of his daughters called Thomas Henwood. Now, all of those names are people who ran the Willaston General Store before the Coombes got there. But this idea that in fact it's a company business is because there's a couple of adverts that say James Davies and Company, and we know for sure that James's daughter Hannah Davies and stepdaughters Hannah and Anne Harris, so he's got a daughter and a stepdaughter both called Hannah, they all run the post office. So it's quite complicated, but it's interesting if you have some connections there. And then the added bit is that the family has a connection to the history of Adelaide Brighton Cement. So you go from lime kilns, fairly primitive looking lime kiln, I've got to tell you, in High Street, Willaston, right the way down and eventually through to the Adelaide Brighton Cement. Okay, now this one I really like. This one really made me excited. South Australia, remember we're the colony that has no convicts? We're convict free? Of course we had convicts. Of course we had convicts. They're ex-convicts though, they've done their time. This gentleman we found out because his descendants are very proud of him, and that imagined shame of having a convict that used to, 30, 40 years ago might have been, it's long gone. So they have written up his story beautifully online, for which I thank them greatly. He came to our attention because he's a bit mysterious. Loyal in his history of Gawler mentions him, but Coombes says nothing. He's silent about it, which is a bit odd, because Coombes is usually pretty spot on. So that immediately put the question marks up. It turns out that Thomas, in 1830, was sentenced in England to 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land for stealing a coat and a handkerchief, sent to the other end of the world. So Addy came. At the end of his sentence, he was granted his ticket of leave, which, if you're a bit like a situation we have now, that ticket of leave means that the convicts were allowed to work for themselves, provided they remained in a specified area. They reported regularly to local authorities and attended divine worship every Sunday if that was possible. And they could not leave the colony in which they had been transported to. So at the end of his time, Thomas set up a business, and he married and had children, but it is reported that he found that ongoing stigma of being a convict very difficult socially for him and his family. A few things happened in his life, and in 1852 he did leave the colony. Not sure, I'd be interested to understand how that happened. And he came to South Australia. And he moved around a lot, and I suspect, of course, you don't walk into a new place saying, oh, hello, I'm an ex-convict from Van Diemen's Land. I think he deliberately set up some smoking mirrors where people didn't know much about him. But he did run a business in Willaston on 2 periods, in 1868 and then again a decade later. So he is one of ours, and I think that adds to the fact that, we needn't be too precious about who was and who wasn't in the early colony. We should be grateful that they decided to come and settle here. Okay, another person that gets me really excited. Most of you would know the shop is what used to be Coston's Motor Repairs just over the bridge on Willaston. It's now a physio, and I've been working with the chap who owns it, who's very interested in getting a bit more. The request came through the history team. We're digging down to a bit more history, and there's been several people who've been really helpful with that. But it turns out Edward Gartrell really was a successful butcher. He's the son of William Henry and Grace Gartrell, who were the founders of Roseworthy. And Roseworthy is actually named after the Gartrell's farm. So Edward and his brother Henry took on the Roseworthy farming and butchering business, and they extended it into Willaston in 1874. The business was incredibly successful, and after 4 years, Edward and his wife, Mary Jane, retired to Semaphore, with echoes of that happening in this century. You know, make a lot of money, buy your house in Semaphore. And he leased the business to Thomas Hodgson and James Clement, and you can see in the two photos. The one on the left is, of course, got the Gartrell name up. The other one, of course, by then, that's the new leasing. Same shop, same business, butchering, but it's in the Hodgson and Clements. And I think there's probably more photos of the lease business. But obviously, retirement didn't suit Edward, because 3 years later, in 1881, he purchased another butchering business in Port Adelaide, into which he incorporated chaff mill, and that building still exists. But things were not all going terribly well, because the lease to Hodgson was finished, cancelled in 1883, and Edward had to return and sort out the business. There was quite a lot about complaints about noise and smell and a whole range of things. So poor old Edward comes back to sort out this business, and he actually relocates his family. 2 years later, he brings his family back from Port Adelaide, and they buy a local property which is described as 7 miles down the North Para River in Angle Vale. Now my guess is that that's going to be fairly substantial. He's made quite a bit of money by then, so if anyone can think of what that property is, please let me know. He left the Port Adelaide business again, this time under the management of his brother-in-law, a man called Thomas Skews. So the Gartrells married into the Skews, big Roseworthy names, still Gawler names today. But that didn't stop him. He must have been still getting on with Hodgson, because in 1887 they're working in a partnership again, providing meat out to the Barossa diggings. So to me, he's a man who just can't stop, but everything he does in this butchery business is doing really, really well. So yeah, interesting. Now, personal thing of mine. Women's suffrage movement, as we know, South Australian, first in the world to get the vote and the right to stand for Parliament. Of course, Gawler was very much involved in that. The first meeting of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was held here in 1889, and that's their medal on the left. And the First Lady is Elizabeth Webb Nichols, who was the Superintendent of the South Australian WCTU. And she came to Gawler and spoke to large crowds about women's suffrage in the Gawler Institute in 89, in 90 and 92. And the Institute was packed with audience. So it was not only women, of course, women and men in Gawler were very interested in the concept. In 94, Mary Lee, the second woman, comes up, and she again speaks in the Institute on women's suffrage. And at that time, many locals signed the women's suffrage petition. And we found, Patricia and I found from Coombe's signature, Harry's father's was on that, but it had been transcribed incorrectly. And so we were able to deal with the archivist who, with proof, corrected it for us, which was just great. But it was lovely to see a family signature. So in 94, Mary Lee comes up in April. In December, the vote goes through Parliament. Women do have the vote. In the very next year, we are starting to discover that Gawler women got organised, and we have the very first female branches of the friendly societies being set up here in Gawler. So again, they're really well organised in getting into positions. And then in 96, Catherine Helen Spence, the last of the three ladies there, she comes to the Institute and she speaks on proportional voting. And she had a strong connection with Harry Coombe, because that was one of his pet topics as well. So well-known South Australian women all came up, probably on the train, I'm going to guess, and spoke at the Gawler Institute. So I like that. we tie into South Australian history quite nicely. And why not? Because we were a major centre then, as we are now. You're going to have to excuse me. I studied economics at high school, so I'm excited by statistics. One of the things we know is that Gawler did very, very well in the 1870s and 1880s. We were lucky enough that there was a huge increase in grain production, and the associated need for agricultural machinery saw us set up with foundries and all the other industries. We know that. So we went through boom times because we were not quite riding off the sheep's back, but we were riding off the agricultural sector. But of course, all things come to an end, and during the 1890s, the old economic downturn thing happens. 1889 saw the end of 5 really bad seasons that was made worse by low wool prices and poor yields in those marginal northern areas. So those of you who know the story, of course, they start to settle the other side of Boyder's line, things go badly, and of course there's not money then to support buying new farming equipment. There's a brief recovery, but we have things like the Great Maritime Strike and the bank crash, and then in Gawler, the result we start to see is that there's growing industrial unrest and unemployment coming around the 1890s. In April of 93, there's a reduction in the May brothers. They reduce all the wages by 10%. A couple of months later, James Martin and Co. introduced this cooperative scheme, which was very unpopular and probably very unfair. Then in 94, there was 8 more dry years, so we were seriously in economic trouble. So all the large grand houses and the grand buildings, you can be quite sure, came at the time when we were riding off the boom time. But by the 1890s, it's a different town and a different culture. Didn't mean that we weren't a strong community. We just had to cope with those economic changes. And in fact, things didn't actually recover to about 1905 in Gawler. So I think if you're looking at a particular part of history, you've got to remember it's not just Gawler. We're affected by what's happening in the colony, but we're also affected by overseas because we're absolutely reliant on the transport system to get our produce overseas and the prices that people overseas are prepared to pay for our goods. Okay, connection with Williamstown. Most of you know that we've still got really strong connections with Williamstown. We've got businesses that have got branches in both places. But it became really obvious that Williamstown was a really strong supporter of Harry Coombe and the Labor Party once it developed. And we type of dug into that a little bit. As you know, it's only 16 kilometres away, so it's travelable. It's quite easily travelled. It had, at that stage, in the 19th century, several sort of small mines in the area, plus it had a forestry and lumber industry, and at that stage, 3 sawmills. But it was also home to several wealthy and influential pastoralists who ran sheep and cattle on large land holdings in the area. And we're now starting to discover that while they had land holdings up at Williamstown, Mount Crawford, they often had farms closer to Gawler, at the end of Carlton Road and over at Concordia, and it sounds like they're bringing their sheep down here to feed on the pastures here as well. So very much connected with Gawler. So when the United Trades and Labour Council started off in Gawler, it was very vocal in representing the interests of the rural and timber workers up at Williamstown. And there were often clashes with the local land barons over the topic of land reform. So at that stage, to vote for members in the upper house, you had to own land. And it was getting to be, it had been contentious for a while, but it really started to heat up. And as I say, Harry jumped into that. What we also then found out, of course, is that he had cousins and their families over there. So there are popes and there are wardens that still live in Williamstown that are connected to the Coombes here in Gawler. Now, there was an organisation called the South Australian Institutes Association, and they've left a good legacy in Gawler. The connection was that Harry was both the president of this association, and for quite a while he was also the editor of their newsletter. Now, this newsletter went out across South Australia to every town that had an institute and was really widely read, and was actually a really good journal, full of information. And in fact, I'm trying to encourage the State Library to seriously consider digitising it, because it's got so much South Australian history that it would be a real boon. In about 1855, the government brought in a subsidy to start providing councils with money to get public libraries going. And for those of you who might remember, the first public library in South Australia opened at Elizabeth in 1957. But the institutes were still running their libraries, and they had been since the 19th century. So as the champion of institutes, this association opposed these free libraries, as they called them. And obviously Gawler had an institute subscribed library, and we were on the other side. In 1976, the then government commissioned a Crawford report on library services in South Australia, because it was becoming inequitable. Some places had these free public libraries with subsidies from the state government and paid for by council, and lots of places, particularly in the country, didn't. And they were trying to sort out and make it more equitable. For me, this is when I came into my library training, so I walked in at this point, and it was interesting, because of course places should get free libraries. That's just a right. It got a bit more heated. In 82, the government ratcheted it up a bit, and they actually created a system where they were going to wind up the South Australian Institute Association by the middle of 89. And they went round and they started to help all the remaining institutes close up, dissolved, as they called it. Now, I was in the library here, and I met a gentleman, lovely gentleman called Bob Broad, who was the last secretary of the Institutes Association, and he very tactfully talked to the Gawler Institute, but they were not having a bar of it. They were not closing up, and good on them. They resisted closure, and they certainly resisted the removal of their records, which were supposed to go back into the city. And it got almost, didn't quite get rough, but there was some determined people, most of whom you know, involved. It was as a bystander, I didn't have to get involved, thank goodness, but as a bystander, I thought, Bob, you're never going to win. And he didn't. In the end, he withdrew. The Institute Committee's role did change, and of course the Gawler Public Library did start. So Gawler did get the benefit of a public library, but it also got the benefit of a strong institute. And so while we were one of the last places in the state to get a public library, what we do have a legacy of this organisation is that we have the Gawler Heritage Collection, because I wonder if they hadn't resisted, I think they would have been considered records, and they would have all gone to town and would have been lost somewhere in the back of the state library. So good on the Institute Association. If you ever get a chance and you want to have a look at those institute journals, they are in the State Library. They're really, if you've got a bit of time, they are really informative about Gawler. This chap, William Henry Carpenter, he's another person from Gawler who became a Member of Parliament, but not for the Barossa. He ended up becoming a Member of Parliament down at Encounter Bay. And the story behind it's a bit interesting. He was actually a locomotive boilermaker and foreman at James Martin from 1891 to 1896. And like Harry Coombe, he was very active in starting up something called the Barossa Political Reform League. And we're still learning about that organisation, but it was actually because up until that stage, the politics here was very conservative and very dominated by these landowners. And with the people, I guess, working at the foundries becoming more unionised, there was a feeling that they needed some alternative candidates. So both William Carpenter and Harry Coombe put their hand up to be the candidate when the Barossa Political Reform League decided to put up a person for the election. Harry became the preferred candidate. And almost as a constellation prize, William seems to have moved down and become the candidate for Encounter Bay. However, ironically, it was William who was successful. Harry wasn't successful in that election. He had to have 3 goes before he became a Member of Parliament. William went straight in, and his fellow candidate, the other successful person down there was the very colourful King O'Malley, who some of you might have read about. So, yeah, he was only in there for a few, sounds like 1 sitting, and then he lost his seat, and he moved across to Western Australia, where he became the Labor member for Fremantle and worked as the editor of the Fremantle Herald. So again, there's lots of comparisons and similarities between him and Harry, but you know, we have produced a lot of parliamentarians, not necessarily local parliamentarians here in Gawler. Right. District Trained Nursing Society. Sorry about the quality of the picture. The lady on the right, and it is a bit fuzzy, is a woman called Mary E. Foster. She was the first district nurse here in Gawler. So the District Trained Nursing Society actually started in Adelaide in 1894, and very, very soon afterwards, one of the founders, Dr Alan Campbell, was invited up to Gawler by the then Mayor, Edward Lucas, to speak at a meeting in the Gawler Town Hall. And as a result of that, a local branch of the service was started here in Gawler. And Harry and his wife Sarah were both long-time members, and eventually they were awarded life membership with this organisation. So in 1896, the society had raised enough money, and they employed, as I said, Mary Foster as their first nurse. In her first year, she is recorded that she made 2,074 visits to 193 patients. If you think about that, she's returning to treat people in their home time after time. And at that stage, the service was really focused on disadvantaged people. Her area covered from Willaston to Gawler South. She's going, there's records that you can read, she's going into small buildings, very crowded, full of people, very large families. She is treating both for industrial accidents that have occurred. She's also treating for the type of diseases that happen if you have crowded people living in less than spectacular housing, is really what it is. She's dealing with the working class of Gawler, and she is flat out busy. She was really very popular though. She's praised in the press by both residents and local doctors, including Dr Popham and Dr Dorr, who said that her assistance reduced the needs for patients to be transferred to hospital. So that tells me she's also a diplomat, because she can work with the doctors, who just occasionally can get a bit territorial, but you know, it all worked really well. But she was so very, very busy. She was walking from around the town, from Willaston to Gawler South, dealing with these, 2,000 visits in a year. So eventually they did more fundraising, and she was a bicycle was purchased for her, and she, rode around on her circuits. I think I'd love to find some photos of that, because she's pretty, she's a pretty dynamic person. She stayed with the District Training Nursing Society for many years. She left Gawler eventually, and she ended up being their superintendent. So she's actually very well known, and there is a great bit written about her and her life in Rob Lynn's book. So if anyone's come across that book, and I'm sure there's a copy in their heritage collection, there's a lot of information there. But she's a pretty forceful and powerful person in public health in Gawler. See, I think there might be a bias here. Maybe I just go looking for the women in Gawler's history, because there's been not a lot written about them. Another person that really jumps out is Jeannie Forster, who received an OBE later in her life. But she has strong connections with Gawler, and if you're reading back through the bunyips, you will see her name jump out all over the place. She started as a freelance journalist with the Register, and that's where I suspect she met Harry, who was also a corresponding journalist for the same newspaper. In 1896, she joined up with Catherine Helen Spence in campaigning for that proportional representation that we talked about earlier. Catherine Helen Spence, of course, died. She was quite elderly when she was doing her proportional representation. And it was left to Jeannie to write Spence's autobiography and she also founded a scholarship in Catherine Helen Spence's name. It was a scholarship for women, and in the third time it was awarded in 1925, a woman called Daisy R. Curtis, who was educated in Gawler, won it. Now, I don't know anything about Curtis's. I think that's be interesting to find out who she was and what she ended up doing and what she did with that scholarship, which might have provided her with the opportunity to go on and do further education or even travel. In 1916, Jeannie really stirred up the North Terrace mob. She became the first female member of the Board of Governors of the Public Library, Museum and Art Gallery. And that was following a decision made by the Vaughan Cabinet to have women on public boards. Whoa, radical. And it echoes today where the same thing's still trying to do, where the government's trying to ensure there are enough women on public boards. She was the first one. She was nominated by the government, not the board. And reading between the lines, I think she might have had a bit of a rough start in that board. I suspect sitting there in with a whole group of elderly gentlemen, she probably found it a bit challenging. She went on to be appointed to the magistracy as a JP, and during the World War I, she was a very active member of the Red Cross, the Australian Wattle Day League and the South Australian Soldiers Fund, and she comes to Gawler regularly during those war years. She's involved a lot in all of the fundraising that occurred here in Gawler. I haven't quite connected her yet, but I'm going to assume that she's a good mate of Flo Barnett's, and she's very much involved in the memorial garden of wattle trees that were somewhere down by where the dog track is now. And we do know that she came up for Harry's funeral. She's mentioned amongst the lists and lists of dignitaries. This one woman's name pops up, and it's Jeannie Young. And then she went on to be one of the first two women to stand for election in the South Australian Parliament in 1918. And sadly she didn't get in. But again, I think she's going to be an interesting person to find out a bit more detail. Gawler and District Age Cottages, probably caught my eye because my husband's on the board. They celebrated 60 years? 50 years? 60 years ago. 60, yeah, I can't remember. They had a celebration and they were celebrating the fact that they started in the 60s. Through my research, they're actually older than that, and I've had a bit of a chat with they actually go back all the way back to 1907. So when we celebrated the Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 here in Gawler, there was a lot of fundraising, and some of that fundraising was put towards a new organisation that was then set up called the Gawler Cottage Homes Committees. And using those funds, the committee purchased and opened 2 cottages in Ton Street for use rent-free by deserving family. And of course, Harry Coombe was on that committee. Now, I'm not quite sure if it's these cottages. I've just put that in as an illustration. I'm prepared to be corrected. But again, that thing, it's Gawler looking after its own. It's for deserving families. And I see evidence about reading, some of them, it's for widows, often for widows that have no other support. In 1915, they opened another 2 homes, and then things just type of meld away. It all goes very quiet until in the 1960s it kicks off again, and at that stage it's called the Gawler and District Age Cottages. So there's a bit of a gap that probably we need to understand what was happening. And of course today this continues, and it's changed its name again, and it's Gawler Community Retirement Homes. So an important community organisation that has a very long history about Gawler people looking after its own. And just one for the rev heads. Sorry. Motor cars in Gawler. So when we were looking at Harry Coombe's funeral in 1917, it was an extremely long cortege that stretched hundreds of cars, hundreds of vehicles. There were horse-drawn and there were motorised vehicles, so we're talking about 1917. The reports in the newspaper say that 9 motor vehicles went down to the Gawler train station and picked up the dignitaries off the train and drove them up to the Willaston Cemetery. And we know that there were several townspeople and delivery businesses in Gawler who owned these vehicles. So I'm going to say we're fairly early adapters. And I know that because in 1916, Council was issuing speeding fines. If you drove in excess of 15 miles per hour, we gotcha. So lots of cars, I'm sure they were noisy, and speeding around no more than 15 miles per hour. But we also had our own motorised ambulance. So I suspect again that the district nursing is you know, there's some lobbying going on by the locals, and we had as I say, our own motorised ambulance, which was delivered by the Ford dealer known as Duncan and Fraser. Not sure if it's any connection. No, sorry, Di, not your fortune. In January 1917, we've got May Brothers and Company setting up a motor garage opposite the Gawler railway station, and they're selling moderately priced Dodge cars to local farmers. I have visions of the sheep in the back, but anyway, never mind. And we also had Gilbert's Garages selling Buicks. Now, I'm not a car person, but they are Buicks. I know because I went online and looked. But we still had horses. We have motor vehicles and we have horse-drawn. And Council at that stage was still using a workhorse for its various outdoor tasks. So, you know, the Council wasn't using those newfangled things. We were still using a horse. When town for people expressing their admiration for Coombe, there was some fundraising done, and they tried to think of a way to build a monument to him, a memorial to him, sorry. There were 4 very popular ideas. They talked about a monument, a scholarship, which seems very fitting to me because he had a lot to do with education, an isolation ward at the hospital, at the Hutchinson Hospital, where he'd been involved, or a band rotunda. They seem to be the most popular ones. The one that really took off, though, was this idea of an isolation ward at the Hutchinson Hospital. At the time, Gawler had a series of infectious diseases that were literally killing people. We had outbreaks of typhoid, pneumonia and tuberculosis. At 1917, when he died, of course, we didn't have the Spanish flu, but that came in soon afterwards with the returning troops coming back with that. So we've had our fair share of pandemics in Gawler before. Interestingly, it didn't get up, but the band rotunda idea, was first mentioned. Was mentioned in terms of a monument to Coombe by Herman Marsh, who some of you might remember. Pretty sure that was Dawn Eastick's dad. I think that's who that was. He was the mayor in December 17, and he was very keen on this band rotunda idea. But it wasn't new. Like most things in Gawler, Cody, it has to come up how many times? At least a few. The idea of having a band rotunda in Gawler, I can first see, was raised in 1900 by bandmaster James Riggs. In 1901, both the Mays and the Riggs Band got in and supported the idea. In 1903, it was brought to Council, which led to the creation the next year of a rotunda fund. Not so much seemed to happen. In 1910, somebody had the good idea that they could use the funds raised to put it in the old cemetery that was mentioned, that Margaret mentioned. But that caused a problem. People were not happy with having entertainment on an old cemetery, so that went nowhere. It came back to Council in 1915. Echoes. Nothing happened. In 1917, as I said, Mayor Marsh thought it would be a good idea, didn't get up. In 1936, somebody suggested that in terms of the centenary of South Australia, Gawler should have a band rotunda. Nothing happened. 1947, Mayor Louis I suggests we should have a band rotunda and we should put it in the market allotment. which, as you know, is where Coles is now. Nothing happened. 1949, let's have a band rotunda on the riverbank near the Baptist church. Didn't happen. 2001, so 101 years later, as a Centenary of Federation project, it's built. And what we have today in Pioneer Park. It just took a little while. Just took a little while. So don't give up if you think you've got a good idea. Be persistent, but just be prepared sometimes to hang around for 101 years. Anyway, being flippant. Oops. Okay. The monument that was actually built to Coombe's, in the end, the money was put towards the paying of his gravesite up at the Willaston Cemetery. So the marble headstone that's still there, and there was also an iron railing which sadly has disappeared. That was built with funds raised by the public. So we do have a memorial to Gawler, to Coombe's in Gawler. It's the grave. Nothing quite as spectacular as the one that's in the main street of Tanunda, but that's another story. Okay, this one I put in, John's not here. Last month you will know that John Lanes came up and talked to us about the larrikins of Gawler. That type of caught my attention, plus, like all things, we're now going back to thinking TAFE is a good idea. And especially with the nuclear submarines, we think we should have this thing where we take young people and train them ready for an industry occupation. I want to read you a quote that was made in 1900 by an anonymous journalist, and he was talking in the SA Register about Gawler's School of Design and School of Mines, which are predecessors to TAFE. So he says, practically Gawler has no larrikin problem. Several police officers in succession have remarked on the singular freedom from crime which the colonial Athens enjoys. The explanation is that a large number of young men have useful and profitable occupation at the various classes during the hours of larrikinism, and thus form studious and elevating habits. In several respects, Gawler has reason to be proud of what is being done in its midst in the way of technical education. So there you go. We should take note of that. So we had no larrikins, so John needs to know that he's not right. Anyway, some things go around, and I'm glad to see that TAFE education is coming back in, but sadly I'm not sure that we'll see it here in Gawler, which is sad because, as Margaret and a few others know, we have a very long, continuous education system in Gawler, and it's not any primary. We've done a lot in the technical education all the way through. So, yeah. So once you'd been to the School of Design or the School of Mines, how did you keep your skills up? We had these things called literary societies and union parliaments. It was of the time, it was their form of social networking and a place for young men and later young women to learn during the 19th and early 20th century. Like our friendly societies, they're based on a principle of mutual benefit. What you put in, you get out. In Gawler we had several. We had several that were associated with the churches. So we had a St Andrew's Literary Society, a St George's, a Congregational Church, all literary societies. We even had the Institute Literary and Sociological Society. What did they do? There were people that gathered together. They had guest speakers, not unlike this. They had members reading of poetry and prose. They had impromptu speeches on various subjects. They held debates and tournaments, and they were testing the members' various skills on stage before an audience. So they're giving people who might have had the most elementary type of primary education and then went into the workforce, they're giving them those skills to be able to speak in public and to be able to debate. And you can guess where that's going to lead to. Some of them broke out and did things like had newsletters and evening classes and conferences. It really started to pick up, and it wasn't just in Gawler, this was going on across the whole of the colony. State, by that stage, sorry. And they got so organised that they actually combined into a union. So there was the Gawler Institute Literary Societies Union. I bet they didn't say that every time. And that had 12 member societies from as far away as Tarlee, Kapunda, Lyndoch, Salisbury and Gawler River. So again, they're all coming in, they're all joining up, they're doing things together, probably holding these conferences. But one of the things that came out of these unions is that they started to hold union parliaments. So we had the Gawler Union Parliament. Sometimes they were known as mock or model parliaments. And these were held to promote the understanding of how government worked and how to advocate for social and political change. They used debating skills and they made the members familiar with parliamentary terms and procedures. And for some of you who've ever had to run a meeting using parliamentary procedures, it's quite technical until you know your way around it. So this was a way of educating people to understand what was happening. And if you wanted to be involved, you were given the skills to do it. We do know it was very useful because many of the members of these union parliaments, then went in and became candidates and stood for Parliament, and in many cases were successful. It also increased public interest and involvement in the federation proposal, and people everywhere, including Gawler, would debate the electoral and voting arrangements that would come in with the new Commonwealth. So in terms of ensuring that people were interested and educated about federation, you know, these were the organisations that were getting everyone involved and engaged. Today, they still continue. There's a thing called Youth Parliament that's run by the YMCA. That's a form of this today. But there are also lots of other services provided for youth by the service organisation. That I know that our youth group and council, youth committee, youth, whatever it's called, Cody, they're tying in. So we're doing the same thing. We're giving our young people the opportunity to get those skills if they want to engage in those type of public speaking, public debating, whatever. So it's good to hear that it's all the way through Gawler. Something for my colleague Brian Samble. Oh, hang on, wrong one. There we go. Tourism and trade has been going in Gawler since 1908. It's not a new thing. And surprise, surprise, the first meeting was chaired by the Mayor, William Dawkins, and the member of the committee, of course, was Harry Coombs. One of the first things they did was to promote the many beauty spots around Gawler, and they organised for the printing of a promotional pamphlet. So if anyone ever comes across a 1908 Gawler tourist pamphlet of Gawler, would you please let us know? I'd love to see what it looked like. I'm pretty sure it would be printed by the Barnetts from a bunyip, but I'd love to see that. That would be something special. And as you know, they eventually went from being called, they started off as the Gawler Tourists Association. They became the Gawler Tourism and Trade Authority for many years, and I know John Dawkins was involved with that. Today, of course, it's slightly split, and we have the Gawler Council Visitor Information Centre on one side, and we have the Gawler Business and Development Group on the other. So again, more than 100 years of promoting Gawler as a place to come and visit, so it's not new. Number 20, yay! It's topical again, the changing boundaries of Gawler. Not a new thing, people. As you know, we started off, we were actually part of the Barossa West District Council up until 1857, when the corporation of the town of Gawler was established. Much, much smaller. The eastern boundary was, surprise, surprise, a street called East Terrace. That was the eastern boundary of Gawler, which probably explains the high proportion of grand houses that are up there, you know, between Murray Street and East Terrace, because of that. But not only was the Gawler councils quite small, so were the others. There were lots of councils around us, and you know the story that we've got Gawler South, and where that, you know, we've got various buildings that were the different council offices at that stage. And we had a chap called Charles Ayling, who lived in Gawler. He was the clerk of 3 adjoining district councils concurrently. So Muddler Wirral South, Manapara East and Gawler South. So he must have gone from one council meeting to another, let me tell you. So, and it's interesting that he was living in Gawler, but he was doing those jobs, and they obviously were part-time jobs. So. And that is the end. So thank you very much for your attention. Yay. To answer any questions, and so is Pat, if you can think of any. If not, and I'm happy to chat if you prefer to chat. As I said at the start, I'll put my notes up if you want to follow up with any of that. If anything's piqued your interest, I'll put the notes up, and I'm happy to show you what we found and share that, because a lot of people shared their research with us, for which we're very grateful. And again, I do encourage you to go and have a look at those great history books at the back. Di, I knew you had a question.
When you were talking about the cottages, you said they were in Todd Street. Those cottages that you showed are actually
in Cameron Street, corner of Todd and Cameron. I am navigationally challenged, I do apologise. Yeah, you're right. Do you think, Adrian, do you think they are the old cottages?
In that picture?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but there is a picture of them in the 1960s.
Right.
Somewhere, yeah, they were really,
Okay, I'll have to get you to help me find them. Yeah, yeah, that looks, because it's a row of four, if they built two with nearly 20 years beside them, I can't, yeah, I'm sure that they would be it. But it'd be interesting to know. Anything else? Oh, Paul.
A couple of questions. How hard was it to get a publisher?
How hard was it to get a publisher?
Yeah.
We were blessed. We were blessed. We still can't believe our luck, Paul. But we were very fortunate because Michael knew something about E.H. Coombe. I don't know how we did that. I don't know. We also applied for a number of grants along the group. So we did a project plan, and then we went seeking grants. The History Society supported us, then the town of Gawler, and finally, on the second go, the History Trust. We were persistent, and the History Trust grant enabled us to engage with Michael. But again, that's not an automatic. Michael has to be persuaded, convinced that it's interesting, and we were lucky. I don't know. I went out and bought cross-lotto tickets, believe me. I don't know how we did it.
Second question.
Second question.
When are you going to start your next book?
I'm not sure. I've got another hobby now, sorry.
Yes. The pub is not a hobby.
I'm really hesitant to ask this question, but there are a couple of people here who aren't from Gawler.
Yes.
Could you please give a couple of sentences on the name you mentioned very often, Harry Coombe?
I'm so sorry. I, of course, assume that everybody knows. His name, he was actually born Henry Ephraim Coombe, but we know him as Ephraim Henry Coombe. He was born in Gawler. He worked as a grocer for the first few years of his life. He trained at the institute, learned skills, became a journalist. At the same time, he was running a confectionery shop in the main street. He then became the editor of the Bunyip, and he remained the editor of the Bunyip for nearly 25 years. And these are all overlapping, because I said people did several jobs at once. And then eventually he became the member of the Barossa for 14 years. He became probably best known because he became the figurehead for the anti-conscription movement in South Australia. Despite the fact that he had 3 sons and a son-in-law fighting overseas, his life was made extremely difficult. He was actually charged under the War something Act. Yeah. War Precautions Act, thank you. Somebody's read the book. And he was charged and fined. And the stress of that saw him collapse at the age of 58. He was actually on stage spruiking for something, and he died a week later. So a man who didn't stop. He was into everything. In Gawler, there wasn't an organisation that he didn't seem to be part of, but he was more of an organiser. He often was the person who set it up. kept the records. So to me, he's a very meticulous man who follows through. But he did a lot for this region as a journalist. He did a lot as a politician. But he's probably best known in South Australia as the anti-conscription bloke. The guy that tried to get not to close the Lutheran schools, not to change the names when they did the non-criminal, well, whatever, the changing of the Germans' names. So yeah, we've known that he's been a Gawler person for a long time, and I think a lot of people have been aware of that. But the research that we did tried to place him in South Australia's history and get acknowledgement not only from us but from a wider part that he's a Gawler man, of whom we're really proud, and I think some of his skills still survive in this town today in terms of community building, perseverance, standing up for the downtrodden. I'd like to think that's a Gawler thing. Hope that answers it. I'm sorry if I assumed you all knew who. We know him as Harry Coombe, even though he's E.H. Coombe. His family and his friends called him Harry. Yeah.
Every meeting's an adventure, isn't it? Okay, thanks very much, Helen. I will now ask Wayne Obbs to come forward for a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Helen, for your presentation. One thing I think on now and then, I think there's a photo of the first car in Gawler, and that was one of the May brothers, and it was in front of their house, which is up that
Sunnybray.
I think you'll find, if I'm not wrong.
No, it probably is.
And the other claim to fame I have is when they originally got around to doing that rotunda, there's a capsule in behind and they've got the name in it.
There you go. There you go.
So there you go. No, it's good to be able to look back at all the things that have happened and made us what we are today. And there hasn't been a lot of presentations that have gone back as far as what you have, bringing all the intricate things that happened, especially in the 1800s in Gawler. So thank you very much, and doing the book to give the information out to anybody that is prepared to read it. Thank you for that, and you grab that, I've got a presentation.
Behind the curtain.
Here we go. Busy for a while, but
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again, John. Thanks, Wayne.